Lecture number 13, California Modernism. So, concurrent with the Great Depression, I talked about social documentary and some of the work of Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange and many others in the last lecture. There is indeed a nexus of photographic movements occurring in America. So I'm going to start by talking about straight photography and group F64. And if you remember, the term straight photography comes from Paul Strand in New York after really changing the views of Alfred Stieglitz and his kind of espousal and support of pictorialism in the camera work days. So in California, on November 15th, 1932, at the DeYoung Memorial Museum in San Francisco, 11 photographers announced themselves as Group F64. These 11 photographers included Ansel Adams, Imogen Cunningham, John Paul Edwards, Preston Holder, Consuelo Kanaga, Alma Lavinson, Sonia Noskowiak, Henry Swift, Willard Van Dyke, Brett Weston, and Edward Weston. So the name F64 refers to the smallest aperture available in a large format view camera at the time. So a corollary of this idea is that the camera was able to see the world more clearly than the human eye because it didn't project personal prejudices onto the subject. The group's effort to present the camera's vision as clearly as possible included advocating the use of aperture f64 in order to provide the greatest depth of field, thus allowing for the largest percentage of the picture to be in sharp focus. Contact printing, a method of making prints by placing photographic paper directly in contact with the negative instead of using an enlarger to project the negative onto paper, and glossy papers instead of matte or artist papers, surfaces which tended to disperse the contours of the objects. So incidentally, the earliest photographic enlarger was invented in 1858 by D.A. Woodward. This was called the Woodward Solar Camera and using sunlight and condenser lenses. But other versions of enlargers had been in wide use since the early 20th century. But the F64 group did not believe in the enlarger. They would want a 1-to-1 ratio between the negative and the print. Edward Weston was born in Illinois. He moved to California and took up photography, running a successful portrait studio in Burbank, California, where he learned a great deal from his collaborator, Margaret Mather, a pictorialist portrait artist. Weston's early work is in the pictorialist tradition, as was many photographers of that era. In 1923, he left his portrait business and went to live in Mexico with his lover, Tina Modotti. She learned from Weston and made a large body of photographic work while in Mexico that eventually left the formal descriptive arrangements of light and shade and became far more political. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So here, the toilet exemplifies Weston's close-up, sharply detailed approach to everyday objects. He compared this image of a toilet with the beautiful form of Greek statues, or the sculptor Constantine Brancusi as influential, according to Weston. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, here's a Brancusi sculpture. So you can see that he's interested in this very simple, formal description. So after living in Mexico, Weston came back to California, where he continued his series of photographs of simple common objects like shells, vegetables, rock formations, gnarled cypress trees. And his series of shells is largely influenced by the California painter Henrietta Shore, whose paintings of shells were very inspiring to Weston. Using natural light and simple, closely cropped compositions, Weston transformed these common objects into sensuous, beautiful images. As Edward Weston phrased it, Camera should be used for recording of life, for rendering the very substance and quintessence of the thing itself, whether it be polished steel or palpitating flesh. And I will return to that idea of the thing itself coming soon. Weston set up home and studio in Carmel Highlands in Central California with his second wife, Charis, with whom he made some of his most well-known nude studies. This is Point Lobos, a place that had magical draw for Weston for most of his life. He made many photographs there. Weston's nudes are often not erotic. Rather, they are glimpses of the body in isolation that resemble his approach to other objects, such as shells and peppers. In a description by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, almost unrecognizable as a nude and equally legible as a landscape or sculpture, the smooth contours of the androgynous form can be appreciated for the integrity and rhythm of their abstract qualities. And this is perhaps his most famous nude. Many of Weston's nudes were made with his second wife, Charis, as a model, and Charis was married to Weston from 1935 to 1945 and was his constant companion, model, writer, and personal driver, as he never actually learned how to drive. And Tina Modotti, who we mentioned before, who had worked with Weston in Mexico, she was an Italian-born actress and model. She met Weston in Los Angeles in 1922. And in 23, she accompanied Weston and his oldest son, Brett, to Mexico City. At the time, he was still married to his first wife, Flora. And in exchange for running his photo studio, Modotti was mentored in photographic techniques from Weston. And this is one of her images. And another Modotti image. And you can see some changes happening. The newly politicized Modotti began making revolutionary photo works in 1927 after joining the Communist Party. She became part of an avant-garde group of Mexican artists, including artists muralist Jose Clemente Orozco, Diego Rivera, and of course Frida Kahlo. Modotti's work reflects a formal style clearly influenced by Weston, but most certainly applied to a very different kind of subject matter. Her images of Mexican laborers and peasants, and more formal stylized arrangements such as the previous, were included in publications such as Mexican Folkways, as well as more radically oriented journals such as El Machete and AIZ. Modotti was expelled from Mexico in 1930 as a result of an anti-communist campaign. She returned to Italy and engaged in an anti-fascist resistance, and due to the deteriorating situation in Italy and Germany, she eventually fled to Moscow. There are no known photographs of Modotti's after 1931, as her work became purely activist in nature. In 1939, she returned to Mexico under a false name and apparently died of heart failure a few years later in 1942. Imogen Cunningham was born in Portland, Oregon in 1883. As a girl, she saw the photograph, Blessed Art Thou Among Women, by Gertrude Casebier, and she decided to become a photographer. She wrote to a correspondence school sending $15 and got her first camera. In Seattle, she learned the art of platinum printing from Edward S. Curtis. She worked in the pictorialist style for a number of years, and after years of photographing her children and garden at home, she opened a portrait studio in Seattle. She photographed an Adam and Eve story, which depicted male and female nudes, and this became quite a scandal in Seattle. Some think she may be the first woman to photograph a male nude, or at least first known woman to photograph a male nude. After moving to California, she became influenced by the more modernist style of photography, having met and befriended Edward Weston. In 1920s, her work shifts to a much more geometric and sharply defined style, which included subjects such as nudes, plants, flowers, and here, a snake in a bucket. Here we can see how the nude is cropped in closely, broken into pure geometry through the cropping and raking light. And Imogen Cunningham is known for filling the frame entirely of her photographs, focusing on texture and light and design. Cunningham's work, particularly close-ups of plants and flowers, were compared to the paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe. Her work was included in the Film und Foto show in Stuttgart, Germany in 1929. The American contributions had been organized by Weston. So Imogen Cunningham, as I mentioned earlier, was a member of Group F64. So this was originally an informal meeting of friends who met to discuss their work and mutual interests in photography. Originally founded by Ansel Adams and Willard Van Dyke in 1932, the name of the group was F64, and it was chosen because the members of the group were dedicated to the honest, sharply defined image and the lens opening f64, which I talked about earlier, the very smallest opening that would give you the most sharpest range of focus. Cunningham was an original member of the F64 group in Oakland, where the group would organize exhibitions and group discussions. And Ansel Adams described the membership of the group as one for, quote, those workers who are striving to define photography as an art form by a simple and direct presentation through purely photographic methods, end quote. Cunningham had a prolific career doing assignments for magazines, running a portrait studio, and teaching at the California School of Fine Arts. She completed a huge quantity of portraits in her lifetime. Particularly noted are the portraits of other artists. This is a piece from one of her last projects, a series of portraits of people after the age of 90, as she was at the time. So she was one of the first people to do portrait studies of the elderly in a way that respected their individuality, as we see in this image. Cunningham lived and worked well into her 90s and passed away in 1976. And here we have a portrait of another artist in F64, Sonia Neskowiak, this portrait by Imogen Cunningham. So Neskowiak was also an original member and began a career in photography in 1929, working first in the Los Angeles studio of Johann Hagemeyer, and then later for Edward Weston. She learned to print from Weston and printed his commercial work for him, and began to develop her own clientele for portraiture. By 1935, she opened her studio in San Francisco, working as a portrait, fashion, and commercial photographer. And here's one of her more famous images, photographing the notable writers of her day, including this image of John Steinbeck. And here's something that has much more kind of formal, descriptive, almost Walker Evans-like look at this textured door. Alma Lavinson was born in San Francisco at the turn of the century. She was largely self-taught and photographed architecture and geometric shapes, focusing on simple, strong compositions. Weston asked her to exhibit with the F-64 group at the De Young Museum in 1932. And this image very reminiscent of Clarence White. This image of Levinson manipulating the lens of her camera is frequently cited by photographers as one of their most favorite self-portraits, although Levinson's face is not shown. In 1996-97, this image was fashioned into a huge banner and used to adorn the New York Public Library's exhibition on the history of women photographers. Her love of simple forms and geometry is apparent here. Levinson went on to undertake a massive documentary project of the gold mining communities of the West, a project that she worked on for more than 35 years. Perhaps the most well-known and commercially successful American photographer of the 20th century is Ansel Adams. Adams grew up in San Francisco and was inspired to become a photographer after visiting the Pan-Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1913, which exhibited art and culture from around the world. He visited the exposition daily rather than going to school and used a small handheld camera to document the things that interested him. He was also a very talented pianist and at one point had to make a decision about which course his life would take. He visited Yosemite frequently as a boy, and as a young man, his work really reflects his lifelong love and respect of natural beauty, particularly that of the California landscape. After visiting with Alfred Stieglitz and Strand in New York, he strengthened his resolve to become a photographer full-time. And here we see his very famous image of the Grand Tetons and Snake River in Wyoming and Idaho. Adams is well known for having devised something called the zone system, a method that allows the photographer to pre-visualize the finished print by comparing light intensities in the scene with a table of tonal values from black to white. And here's Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, 1949. And Mount Williamson, Sierra Nevada, from Manzanar, California, 1944, which leads us to another project that Adams completed. So, of course, though most well known for his landscapes, Adams worked in a number of genres, including portraiture and still life. He completed a documentary project of the Japanese internment camp called the Manzanar Relocation Center in Owens Valley of California during World War II. This series was a departure from his usual landscape photography. Adams produced an essay on the Japanese Americans interned in this beautiful but remote and undeveloped region. He concentrated on the internees and their activities. He photographed family life in the barracks, welders, farmers, garment makers, and people doing recreational activities. When offering the collection of works to the Library of Congress in 1965, Adams said in a letter, "The purpose of my work was to show how these people, suffering under a great injustice and loss of property, businesses, and professions, had overcome the sense of defeat and despair by building for themselves a vital community in an arid but magnificent environment. All in all, I think this Manzanar collection is an important historical document, and I trust it can be put to good use." So the influence of the California modernist photographers and also photographers associated with them is really profound, as their work and approach was extremely influential in the founding and development of photography as fine art programs in art schools and institutions across the nation. And that's the end of today's lecture. Thanks for listening.